Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. Today I'm going to show you how to paint a Genestealer Cultist, ideal for your games of Warhammer 40,000 to lead the Genestealer incursions against the forces of the Imperium. So the first thing I've done is I've primed the model black, as this will give us a nice, smooth, even base coat for the rest of our colours to work from. Now the first thing I'm doing is I'm coming in with some Abaddon black, and I'm going to paint this all over the model. This may seem a little bit weird, painting black over a black primer, but the Chaos Black spray has a slightly different finish to the Abaddon black paint from a pot. So this way, if you make any mistakes, they're really easy to tidy up later on with some Abaddon black. Because the first thing we're going to be doing on this model is painting a lot of the black details. So by painting the whole model black now, we get that solid black coat underneath, which we can tidy up if needed later. So now we've painted the entire model with Abaddon black, we're ready to begin dry brushing some of the black details. So the first dry brush I'll be coming in with is Metalmania Standard Grey. For this, I'm going to dry brush all of the areas that I want of the finished model to be black. So it's all of these parts of sort of armour padding on his knees, his boots, his gloves. I'm also going to get the casing to his gun at this stage as well. Any pipes, any detailing like that, I want to catch all of these areas now with a dry brush of Metalmania Standard Grey. Because it's much easier to paint these areas first and then paint the rest of the model around them than it will be to come back in later and carefully try and edge highlight all of these small details. So I'm just dry brushing over all of the areas that I'm going to want to be black with some Metalmania Standard Grey. Doesn't matter if I'm a bit messy and get this over other areas, we'll be painting all the rest of the model later. But make sure you dry brush all of the areas that we want to be black at the end of the model with some Metalmania Standard Grey. After that dry brush applied, you can see how we've picked out lots of detailing, added definition to a lot of the areas. There's one more dry brush I'm going to apply to these black details, and that's with some Dawnstone. Now I'm going to be a lot lighter with this dry brush, so it just catches the very sharp details and edges. I'm going to go back over all the areas I just dry brushed with Metalmania Standard Grey and catch all of these details with a light dry brush of Dawnstone. By painting all the black parts this way now, it makes it a lot easier for later on and speeds up painting the model in the long run. So it actually makes it a lot easier if you've got to batch paint a lot of these Genestealer cults. By doing all the black details first, it saves us time. After all that dry brushing, I'm coming in with some MacLeod blue now. I'm going to start painting all of the fabric areas to the model. Obviously, you can pick your own colour for whatever uniform you want your Genestealer Cultist to have. But I'm going to paint a MacLeod blue all over the details of fabric, like the arms and the trousers. Making sure I catch these with a couple of layers of MacLeod blue. Obviously, being really careful around all the areas that we've already painted and dry brushed that we want to be black. But just carefully working around, picking out all of the trousers, arms, and details like that on the model with some MacLeod blue. Fine blue gives a really nice little worker's uniform for the model. Kind of guys that would work in a mine or in a factory, something like that. The sort of ideal people for a Genestealer cult uprising. And after the MacLeod blue's been applied, you see I've got a solid coat all over the uniform to the model. So the next step is I'm going to pick out a few of the other fabric details. For this, I'll be using Mephiston Red. So I'm going to pick out things here like this fabric hanging down from his waist. Obviously being really careful around the areas of blue. I'm just making sure I pick out all of this fabric with a couple of layers of Mephiston Red until I get a solid red colour all over. I'm also going to pick out these straps here on his legs as well. So once again, just carefully coating these with a couple of layers of Mephiston red until I get a solid base coat all over these straps. With the Mephiston red applied, it's added that little pop of colour to the model and broken up that blue a little bit. So the next thing I'm going to paint are the leather pouches, straps on the model. For this I'll be using Rhinox hide. I'm going to pick out things like the gun holster on his waist. Just carefully applying a couple of layers of Rhinox hide to all the pouches. I'm going to pick out the strap, going around his leg, any bits of belts or anything like that on the model. I'm just going to carefully pick these out with some Rhinox hide. Pouches and details picked out. The next thing I'm going to paint is the skin to this Genestealer Cultist. And for the skin, I'll be using Kislev flesh as my base coat. This is a very light skin tone, so the coverage isn't going to be great. It is going to take a couple of layers to build up to a solid coat all over the skin. Now this one here has this tube coming from his nose, so I'm going to try and be really careful and not catch this with any Kislev flesh. But if I do, I can tidy back up with some Abaddon black later. By using this much lighter skin tone, it's going to give us that really sickly Genestealer cult look to the skin. So just make sure in a couple of layers you build up to a solid coat of Kislev flesh all over any exposed areas of skin. So this one, we've got the face and these arm parts here showing for the skin. So I'm carefully making sure I pick these out with a couple of layers of Kislev flesh until I build up to a solid base coat. And after a few layers, I've got that solid, sickly skin look to my Genestealer Cultist. So now it's time to pick out a few of the metallic details. So first of all, with some lead belcher, I'm going to pick out anything that I want to be sort of steel. So it's going to be all of the armour, so these shoulder pads, and the metallic parts of the armour here. I'm catching these with a couple of layers of lead belcher. Obviously being really careful now around all the other colours we've already painted, especially the black. I carefully make sure I pick out all of these details with some lead belcher. But there is obviously the light on his shoulder as well. So I'm just going to coat all of this with lead belcher. I'll come back in later and paint the light on the top. Things like the casing to the backpack and stuff here, catching all of this with some lead belcher. Just being nice and neat, nice and careful around the other details. There's also a couple of grenades hanging from his waist, so I'm going to catch these with some lead belcher as well. And the handle to the pistol, all of these sort of details. I'm just going to carefully pick these out. I'm also picking out this chain here, holding up the symbol. And finally, some of the detailing on the weapon. So it's things like the magazine, the handle, any of the metallic details on the body of the weapon. I'm just going to make sure I pick all of these out with some lead belcher. We've already painted and highlighted the casing, so I'm being really careful to make sure I don't get this over any of that black. I'm just picking some details and catching all of these with a coat of lead belcher. There's all of the sort of steel details on the Genestealer painted, so that's just one final base coat left to apply. That's going to be with some Retributor armour. I'm going to pick out the Genestealer cult symbol hanging from his waist. I thought this would be a nice pop of gold colour, so I'm just carefully picking this out with a layer of Retributor armour. With that symbol picked out, that is all of the base coats applied on the model. So now it's time to apply some shades. The first shade I'm going to apply is some Caliburg Crimson. I'm going to apply this all over the skin. This is what's going to give that sort of Genestealer Cultist purple look to the skin. Why I use Kislev flesh as the base tone. So I'm just making sure I apply this all over the exposed skin. Don't want it to pull too heavily in the recesses. If it does start pooling, wick it away with a dry brush. Just make sure you shade all of that skin with some Carroburg Crimson. And now with some Nuln Oil, I'm going to shade everything else. So it's going to be all the areas we paint with Lead Belcher, MacLeod Blue, Mephiston Red, Rhinox Hide, and Retributor Armour, trying to avoid getting any of the areas we painted with black. But for the rest of it, I'm just catching all of these areas with a shade of Nuln Oil. So this will darken these areas down, sink into the recesses and add some definition. Really make all of the details on our Genestealer Cultists pop. So just make sure you catch all the other areas other than the skin and the black with a shade of Nuln Oil. If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. If you would like to support the channel and become a member, please press the join button down below. And after all of those shades have dried, you can see how they've added definition all over our Genestealer Cultist. So it's time to start highlighting the model. And the first thing I'm going to highlight is the skin. So I'm coming in first of all with some Kislev Flesh. For this I'm going to apply it wherever the shade didn't settle. So wherever we've got that purple in the recesses, I'm leaving that, but coming in and catching all of the raised details with a little bit of Kislev Flesh, just to bring these areas back up to that brighter colour. So we're working with some really small areas here. So really take your time. Work with some thinned down paint so it leaves a little bit of the purple showing through. And just work your way around all of the skin, applying a layer of thin Kislev Flesh to everywhere that the shade didn't settle. So you can see on areas here like the cheeks and things, we've got all of that shade into all of those recesses. So I'm leaving that, coming back on either side and brightening all of these details back up with some Kislev Flesh. So you really want a nice fine tip on your brush for this. So we leave all that Carroburg Crimson in those recesses, but we can bring the rest of the details back up to their brighter, sickly skin colour of Kislev Flesh. Don't forget to do the same to any exposed skin on the arms as well. I'm leaving that Carroburg Crimson in the recesses and brightening the rest up with some Kislev Flesh. With that Kislev Flesh applied, you can see how we've brightened up the skin, but we've still got that definition from the Carroburg Crimson. It's really given us that sickly look of a Genestealer Cultist. So now with some Flayed One Flesh, I'm going to apply this in the middle of the areas I just applied the Kislev Flesh. So this is another sickly looking skin colour. I'm making sure I leave a little bit of the Kislev Flesh showing, focusing this onto the more raised and upwards facing parts of the skin, and just applying small parts of Flayed One Flesh to all of these areas. I'm making sure you leave some Kislev Flesh showing through around. You get a nice transition from the darker up to the lighter areas, slowly building these layers up so I get a nice transition all over the skin. That Flayed One Flesh really brightened up the skin now, giving him that horrid sickly look. So now just with some Pallid Witch Flesh, I'm going to apply a spot highlight to some of the sharpest points on the skin. So this is just areas like the tip of his nose, the eyebrows, bottom lip, chin, areas like that. I'm just applying small spots of Pallid Witch Flesh as a final highlight on the skin, just for the brightest and most raised areas, which is really going to give that impression of very thin skin and really accentuate the purple and give a great Genestealer look to our model. With the Pallid Witch Flesh applied, that is all of the skin highlighted. So next thing I'm going to do is paint the eyes to finish off the face and really give a focal point to the model. So for the eyes, I'm coming in first with Abaddon Black. I'm going to very carefully sink this into the recesses of the eye socket. I'm being really careful around the skin we've painted and highlighted, but just sinking a little bit of Abaddon Black into the eye sockets of the model. Now with a little bit of white scar, I'm coming in and I'm going to apply a small horizontal line in the middle of the Abaddon black we just applied. Keeping this really thin, making sure I have some of the black showing through around the white. Just applying a small line in the middle of the eyes. And then finally with some Abaddon black again, I'm painting a small vertical line in the middle of the white. This will give the impression of a pupil, really create a focal point on the face of our model and add interest to our Genestealer Cultist. So with those eyes painted, that is all of the face finished off on our Genestealer Cultist. So now it's time to start highlighting the uniform. First of all, I'm coming back in with some MacLeod blue again, and I'm going to brighten up the areas that were darkened down by the shade. So much like with the skin, wherever the known oil settled in a recess, I'm leaving that, coming in on either side and brightening up the flatter and raised areas back up to their brighter colour with a layer of MacLeod blue. So I'm making sure I leave all of that known oil as a shade in the recess, but I'm coming in on either side of any parts where it's settled and brightening it back up to its original MacLeod blue colour. With the MacLeod blue applied, it's brightened up those parts of uniform. So it's time to apply an edge highlight to all the creases and folds. For that, I'll be using Calgar blue. I'm just going to carefully apply a small edge highlight to the tops of any folds in the fabric. So we've got a sharp line or sharp point, just coming in with a little bit of Calgar blue and applying a thin edge highlight to the highest, most raised parts of the uniform. This is going to up the contrast slightly on that uniform, add some interest all over, and give the impression of light catching on the sharpest points. So once again, take your time at this stage and just pick out all of those creases and folds with a thin edge highlight of Calgar blue. You see how it's brightened up that uniform and added some interest to the model. So I'm going to do the same to all of the areas of red fabric. For this, I'm coming in with Mephiston red first. And much like with the blue, applying it to all the areas the shade didn't settle. So wherever the known oils in one of those recesses, coming on either side and brightening up all of the creases and folds back up to a brighter colour with a small amount of Mephiston red. We're dealing with some very small areas here, so be nice and careful. Just make sure you leave that known oil in the recesses and brighten the rest of the fabric up with a little bit of Mephiston red. And the Mephiston red brightened back up. So we've got that nice transition from the dark to the light. So that's one final highlight to apply to the red, and that's with some Wild Rider red. I'm going to apply a thin edge highlight to all the sharpest points and tops of the folds. So I'm working around the edge of the fabric. On all of the sharp points, I'm applying a small edge highlight of Wild Rider red, just like the light's catching these areas. By keeping these nice and thin, you'll allow that Mephiston red to show through around it, which gives a nice transition from the darkest to the lightest areas. So with all of the red fabric highlighted, next thing I'm going to highlight all of the pouches we paint with Rhinox hide. So first of all, I'm coming in with Rhinox hide again. And where the known oil's gone into a recess and darkened those areas down, I'm leaving that darkened down Rhinox hide, but bringing the rest of the flatter, smoothed and raised areas back up to their original colour with a couple of thin layers of Rhinox hide. with the pouches brightened back up. Next thing is to apply a small edge highlight. For this I'll be using Mournfang Brown. I'm just going to capture the very sharpest points and edges with a thin edge highlight of Mournfang Brown. So on these pouches, it's around all the flaps and the very edges, just catching these with a small line of Mournfang Brown. For the straps going across his leg, I'm just catching the very edges with a small edge highlight as well. With the pouches highlighted, the model's really coming together now. The next thing I'm going to do to add that real pop of colour and interest is paint the light on the model. For this I'm using Avalan Sunset. I'm going to paint this all over the light on his shoulder. Now there's a few other spots of light on the model. Feel free to mix your colours up. Do these with greens and blues and things like that. Now after I've painted the light, I'm coming with Flash Gits Yellow. For this I'm going to add a thin crescent moon shaped line at the very bottom of the light. And finally, with some white scar, I'm adding a reflection point in the opposite corner to the line we just painted. This gives the impression of a light source. Really adds some interest to your Genestealer cults. See, I've painted some of the other lights as well. So we've got some green ones and some red ones. They're all done using the same methods. They really add interest to the model. So now with some Stormhost Silver, it's time to highlight all of the metallic details on the model. So I'm just going to carefully apply a thin edge highlight of Stormhost Silver to all the sharp points to the body armour. And the details on the gun and things like that. I'm just making sure I catch all of these with a thin edge highlight of Stormhost Silver. This is going to give the impression of light catching on metal. You don't need to go too heavy with these, but just make sure you catch the sharpest points, the most raised details of the metallics with an edge highlight of Stormhost Silver. Stormhost Silver applied, you can see how it's made those metallics really pop on the model. So there's just one final highlight left to apply to our Genestealer Cultist, and that's with a bit of Liberator Gold. I'm going to highlight the Genestealer Cult icon hanging from his waist. For this I'm just catching the very edges with a really thin edge highlight of Liberator Gold, just to make that symbol shine. And with the Liberator Gold applied, that is how to paint up a Genestealer Cultist for your games of Warhammer 40,000. Using this method, you can quickly and easily paint up a whole squad of these guys. So thank you very much for watching. Please let me know in the comments down below, are there any other models you would like to see me paint? But don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, an extra special thank you to Jenkins, our Tea Lover channel member. Thank you so much for the support, and happy painting!